there was very little enthusiasm of seeing the country dragged again in ill-timed geopolitical escalation. And in a way, seeing the Iraqi people paying the price for whatever score settling process is going on. Kataib Hezbollah has shown very little restraint when it comes to really claiming and admitting to having overstepped the mandate of engaging in operations that do not come from the directives of the commander-in-chief.
From the beginning of the Iran war, Iraq has been part of the equation. According to some reports, as many as half of the projectiles launched at Saudi oil facilities and other infrastructure came from Iranian-backed or Iranian-aligned Shia militias in Iraq. This has been an extraordinary development, and I think what's even more extraordinary is that those Shia militias haven't even begun to use their full capacity. They were the ones responsible for pummeling the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. They hit the U.S. consulate in Erbil, causing evacuations. Essentially causing a mass evacuation of the entire NATO force and the entire Western force that was in Iraq. I am Borzu Deragahi. This is my Substack podcast newsletter. It's called Badlands. You can subscribe at Borzu, BORZOU.substack.com. And I'm joined today by a very special guest. Her name is Ina Rudolph. She is an expert on Iraq's Shia militias, and she's writing a book called Iraq's Shia Warriors. From what was it from Parliament?
Parliament.
From what to Parliament?
From battlefield to Parliament.
From battlefield to Parliament. And she is also a scholar, a noted scholar, a senior research fellow at the International Center for, I want to get it right here, International Center for the Study of Radicalization, and a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for the Study of Divided Societies. And you're at King's College, or that's where you studied?
Yes, at the War Studies Department.
And she's at the famous War Studies Department at King's College in London. I want to say, just on a personal note, I was there in the city of Kufra in southern Iraq when Muqtada Sadr in 2003 announced the birth of the Mahdi army, the Jaish al-Mahdi, and what he said was going to be a people's armed force. At the time, it was not clear if they would be armed or not. And I was there. I remember the people kind of lining up to sign up for these militias. And at the time, everyone laughed. Everyone in Baghdad, the Americans, or the international community, they thought it was a kind of joke. Now here we are 23 years later, and these militias are lording not only over the Iraqi government, but also now being a factor, being a player in geopolitics in the Middle East. Ina, could you just tell us a little bit about, just based on the news of the day, and the fact that you have this grudge match going on right now in the Iraqi government about the next Iraqi government, with Trump playing a role and so on. Just very briefly, where are the Shia militias at right now? I know there's a bunch of them, and they're not all the same politics. There's different levels. Some are even, supposedly anti-Iran, they say. But what do you think, just in general, where are we now with these militias?
Borzu is an excellent question. And as you say, we have to draw on the current power dynamics and the discussions that we're witnessing in Parliament. Right now, the most important fragmentation that Iraq's going through is within the Shia power circles, within the so-called Shia coordination framework, where a consensus has still not been reached on the candidate for the prime minister's position. And we also have to be very precise, especially with terminology such as militias, paramilitaries. There is a whole academic discussion on how to define those groups. But what is important is that most of the parties within this Shia coordination framework have so-called affiliate armed factions, a lot of them registered within the structures of the Hashd al-Shabi, or the Popular Mobilization Forces. Now, the controversy comes from the fact that the Hashd, by law, whether we like it or some not so much, is a state-sanctioned, a state-approved, regulated paramilitary security agency. with its
Right. Let me
own
just give
mandate.
a let me just give a note there. I should have mentioned this Hashd al-Sha'abi, the Popular Mobilization. This is an important institution now in Iraq. This was the attempt by the Iraqi government to bring these militias in line. Instead, sometimes the militias bring the Iraqi government in line. Please go ahead, Ina.
Exactly. And the controversy, as you were about to illuminate, comes from the fact that certain forces, such as Kataib Hezbollah, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, they have brigades registered within the Hashd al-Shabi as an umbrella network, but they also preserve fighting units outside of this structure.
Hmm.
And right now, there is still an ongoing and very, very difficult discussion with leaders from those formations, whether it makes sense for them to kind of integrate within state structures and under state structures what's being presumed is the PMF and not an assimilation within the structures of the Iraqi army or Iraqi police or all of these illusionary scenarios that have been discussed.
Yeah, just as a note, PMF is an acronym for Popular Mobilization Forces, if you're listening or watching. Just a question for you. What role did they play in the recent conflict? We saw some news reports in the war with Iran. Were they basically Iran's arm? Were they, for example, I was wondering myself, you had all these attacks on Kuwait, all these attacks on Saudi, which some say many of them came from Iraq. What else did they do? How much damage did they do, if you can assess?
So most of the attacks that have been announced or claimed, actually since the beginning of October 7, not just the last round between the US and Iran, has been claimed under the framework of al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya fil Iraq, the Islamic resistance in Iraq. Now, this has been, to an extent, also attempt to protect the institutional identity of the PMF, of the Hashd, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, by law, falls under the authority of the commander-in-chief. So they are also represented within the joint operations, the joint operational command room, and therefore their orders, legally speaking, come from the commander-in-chief. Now, the controversy, again, is in the fact, can we really guarantee that there is no one on the PMF payroll that also has some affiliation to the IRI, the Islamic resistance in Iraq? But at least cosmetically speaking, there has been a very serious attempt to try to discern these two structures. The PMF as an institution has not taken any stance in terms of we would be claiming attacks, we would get militarily involved. And this is the same narrative that we also saw during the events in Syria, where there were again speculations: will the Hashd jump across the border and try to salvage their Syrian ally in the face of Bashar al-Assad, which did not materialize. And even back then, from the leadership of the PMF, which is headed by the chairman Falih al-Fayyad, the narrative was very disciplined. We are under the directives of the commander-in-chief. We have full military capacity to strengthen the Iraq-Syrian border, to prevent any sort of security spillover. But there was no messaging in terms of us being ready and willing to take a stance or to get militarily involved in the Syrian conflict. And even back then, like before, where there were evidence-based reports for the presence of some of these armed formations in Syria, and again, fighting on the side of the Syrian regime. And they have been very open about that. This was never done under a Hashd mandate. So in a way, what we really underestimate in the West is their emphasis and their interest, in a way, fascination with the law. They're really determined to preserve this legal cover, to abide by whatever terminology has been inscribed in the charter, in the founding law of this institution. And this also determines the way they engage in political and military communication through all of the channels.
Just to get back on something you were saying about the what they called, and this is a concept I didn't even know about. This is an institution I didn't know about. This Islamic resistance of Iraq. Now, is this a parallel institution? Is this a concept? Does the Islamic resistance of Iraq have have offices and so on, or is it just a kind of because this is fascinating. It sounds like they have on the one hand the PMF, and then they have this parallel mandate or institution. What is the Islamic resistance of Iraq?
So they are separate. The PMF is a legal institution. It has their offices, headquarters, budget approved by the state.
Minister, yes.
Even under the last administration, there was a government decision to have a state-owned company named Mohammed, after Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was killed next to Qasem Soleimani in the strike. But the IRI, I think the most precise way to describe it is like the resurfaced or reclaimed label under which those attacks are being claimed. Now, you have also a lot of divisions, different currents within the PMF. You have armed factions that have no interest of getting involved or dragging Iraq into further geopolitical escalations. You have those like that have grown more state-oriented in their vision and do not want to be engaging in resistance operations outside of the formal chain of command. But this, again, like here, the complexity really comes to light. This does not mean like that they are anti-Iran or that they are no longer ideologically aligned or that they do not think in transnational terms. It's just a different mode of prioritization of their domestic interests, of preserving their stakes on the ground. And if we have to be really precise, which we have to be if we want to engage with the realities on the ground, is really to go group by group and to analyze what are their institutional stakes, what is the level of representation in parliament, what is their level of entrenchment in government or formal administrative institutions, what is the level of engagement with clergy in Iran. And last but not least, what is their popularity on the ground? And this requires a lot of work. It requires really looking at the biography, the trajectory of the group in a way, if you want to see, of tracking personal relations, if in some cases it can be between the commander of the faction and he can be endorsed by ayatollahs in Iran as their representative in Iraq, which would allow him like benefit materially also from that position. So I just wanted to highlight for our listeners, for our readers, the complexity and how important it is really to know these nuances. If we want to engage constructively, if we really want to make an impact, it has made no sense to throw them all in this basket of de-Iran aligned militias.
Right.
This sounds very clear.
So how did they react? How did in general, how did the armed groups react to February 28th when the supreme leader was killed? I mean, we know that everyone in the Shia world reacted, including Sistani. How did, let's say, Kataib Hezbollah react?
It's a very different reaction when it comes to demonstrating publicly your solidarity, condemning the assassination, even in some cases like adopting very almost Western language in terms of the principles of respecting international law and so on and so on. Being present at mourning processions, but then again, like Kataib Hezbollah is like on the farthest right of the spectrum, and their rhetoric was much more militant than in comparison to other groups. Also, Kataib Hezbollah has shown very little restraint when it comes to really claiming and admitting to having overstepped the mandate of engaging in operations that do not come like from the directives of the commander-in-chief. But this does not apply to a lot of the armed formations within the Hashd, who are more, as I said, like institutional terms, more state-oriented, more keen on engaging in a power consolidation process within the institution. And I'm not saying this in terms of whitewashing or saying like
No,
those
no,
that
no.
are
Sure.
are more humanitarian in a way in their thinking. But it's just about, again, what presence, what stakes do you have on the ground, and how do you intend to preserve those? What are your networks? What's your support base? And also, I mean, with the mood on the Iraqi streets, like there was very little enthusiasm of seeing the country dragged again in ill-timed geopolitical escalation. And in a way, seeing the Iraqi people paying the price for whatever score settling process is going on.
Just to review, these militias started out as a way of standing up for Iraqi Shia rights against Sunni insurgents. They later quickly became a kind of force that was fighting the US. That sort of calmed down, and then they engaged in politics a little bit, especially Muqtada Sadr's militia, and that kind of turned those militias and that the sub-militias and the offshoots really were energized with the introduction of ISIS in 2014, when they formed the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization. This force became such a, I guess, legitimate force after fighting against ISIS in Anbar and Mosul and so on, that at that point they were given this kind of legitimacy. But there's always been this question as to whether some or many of these groups are also doing what Hezbollah does in Lebanon, which is serve as a kind of force for Iran. We do know that there were some attacks, though, from Iraq, into Kuwait, into Israel, even towards Israel. There was attacks, not just in this war, in previous conflicts as well. How does that fit into the mandate of Hashd al-Shabi, if at all? And what is the Iraqi state and other elements of the, let's say Kataib Hezbollah decides to launch something like 100 rockets, apparently, at Saudi Arabia or Kuwait and so on. How does that play into how do the other Shia militias and the Iraqi government react to that, and how does it play in Iraq?
The Iraqi government is very determined already. I mean, since before Sudani came to power, this has been like the Gretchen question within Iraqi politics, like how to deal with all of those forces that, for some reason, and I can go deeper into the rhetoric or into the justification narrative, why do they need to have forces outside of the control of the government? And in a way, the narrative from the resistance group has been that in order to prevent a catastrophe such as what the Iraqi state had to go through with ISIS, with the collapse of the official military infrastructure and the collapse of the Iraqi armed forces back then, what was needed was a popular mobilization wave to go and get engaged and defend the homeland. So in a way, in the thinking of a lot of the more, let's say, para-state armed formations, there is still this logic that the Hashd is already on the path of becoming a very bureaucratic state security institution. And that in a way, the resistance has to preserve arms, even outside of the Hashd, to be able to defend the state, the homeland, whatever idea they have of the Iraqi state or how the Iraqi state should be, which is also a very interesting question, that they need to preserve those weapons to be able to defend the homeland. Now, under Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, like there was an intensified process towards security sector reform, and there were ongoing dialogue how to engage with the leaders of those factions to basically encourage them to put all of their units within the structures of the state. And I want to tell you, and I mean, it's not an anecdote, it's actually an evident interview, an evident speech made by Qais al-Hazali, the leader of Saib Ahl al-Haq.
Yeah.
It was made
League of Rights, if that's a good translation.
The point that Qais was trying to make in this statement is calling on the resistance and making the point, we have to lead by example. Of course, the weapons of the resistance have to be in the hands of the state. Now, this for some can sound very promising or very positively engaging with the notion of state sovereignty. But he also added, because we are the state. And this really reviews for you the difference between the challenges of pursuing demilitarization in Lebanon, where I would say a lot of the high-ranking representatives from within the Shia sect, like those involved in the structures of Amal, Hezbollah, they do not really feel that their positions within the state infrastructure are now particularly secure, especially since whatever transpired after October 7th. In Iraq, it's the opposite. I mean, for someone like Qais al-Hazali to go public and to call on his brothers in arms to say, now it's the time to build the state. And this is the important part to understand the trajectory of those groups. And I think the most interesting groups are not necessarily Kataib Hezbollah. I think groups like Asaib Ahl al-Haq are much more interesting ideologically and philosophically speaking. Because in their trajectory, as you said, like he comes from the Sadrist milieu. After that, again, like with Iranian support, he was able to launch his own armed outlets, resistance faction. The whole thing was integrated within the structures of Hashd al-Sha'bi during the course of the counter-ISIS campaign. And for the first time, the group participated with its own independent list in elections, and they managed to get 27 seats. Now, this very influences the way they think about the state and the way they think about statehood. So if you track their public statements, they say that their goal now is not just pursuing resistance, their goal is building the state. In a way, if you compare the institutional jargon that's being used, it's very similar when you listen to Western leaders about the importance of institutions, and someone like Qais al-Hazali, who does not miss an opportunity to address like the importance of preserving the principles of international humanitarian law, condemning lack of action when it comes to defending the lives of civilians in Lebanon and in Gaza, and then domestically speaking, talking about the importance of building up the state and having monopoly on the use of force. So this is very important when we try to understand those groups. In a way, it can be interpreted as a division of labor, where you have, again, like those involved in state building, in statecraft, and those that have decided that they prioritized armed resistance and not so much entrenching themselves in political structures.
How would they justify, in terms of armed resistance, how would they justify taking part in Iran's war against the region? I mean, how does that fit into the rhetoric of armed resistance on behalf of the Iraqis?
Armed resistance on behalf of the Iraqis, like there, the narrative is very similar in a way to how pro-Hezbollah politicians have attempted to justify why they got involved in the last round. So more or less there, the threat perception is very high. There is high awareness of this whole narrative of the new Middle East. And in a way that there is almost not a mandate, but an imperative to get involved in defense of Shia brethren, and not just of Shia brethren. There was also like a very strong condemnation when the attack on Qatar happened. This was very strong, like even like from groups like Asaib Ahl al-Haq, Kataib, Hezbollah. So in a way, like they're even like trying to invigorate a sense of ummah, a sense of like cross-sectarian solidarity, to make it about really resisting injustice, standing up in defense of communities that are the most vulnerable, that are subjected to daily Israeli strikes and all of that. But again, like this does not mean that the Hashd as an institution is defending attacks in Kuwait, like this is something unthinkable. So it's very important, really, like to always look who is speaking and with what kind of mandate he has.
This might be a tough question, but would you call these groups that are going outside of the state, outside of the Hashd, and taking part in armed conflicts regionally, would you call them rogue elements?
I mean, of course it's rogue elements.
Okay.
Because, I mean, the moment you take for yourself the decision to decide on matters of war and peace, you're already violating the mandate of the executive. And even like the very philosophy, institutional DNA behind the Hashd, like where the logic was to consolidate this institution within the structures of the Iraqi state. So from within those circles that were more keen on consolidating this narrative of the Hashd, like being one of the pillars of the national defense infrastructure, it was not meant as an institution that's there to supplement the Iraqi army, but there was always the attempt to make it about being the four pillars of the rope in a way. And I've heard like this metaphor even when I interviewed Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, like back then, 2018. So it's a very, in a way, it's a very different game. The threat perception may be a shared one, but the pain threshold of each of those formations is very different, and it determines very much how they engage publicly, to which extent are they willing like to be just communicating very fiery statements in solidarity with the Islamic Republic, but like also to which extent would they be willing to say, yes, our group did get involved in a resistance operation that completely contradicted whatever foreign policy line was dictated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Is there any level of clarity as to what extent there is coordination between Iran and some of these rogue elements? Has there been any, have you been able to make any hypothesis as to whether they are actually taking orders, acting on their own, getting general guidelines, and so on?
Now, this is also a very important question, because here we see the dynamics and what has changed since October 7, and like since all of these like operational blows that were inflicted on Hezbollah. So already there, the messaging from Iran was that each allied resistance unit was, in a way, even commissioned and encouraged to take decisions based on their own assessment of the domestic variables. So it was not even, if I speak now that this group or that group had more autonomy on the ground, this does not really mean like that they're going against Iranian directives. It rather means like that there was a very sobering analysis of the geopolitical dynamics of the ground, and that those embedded allies were being given a mandate to act more autonomously when it comes like to not compromising communication lines, when it comes to having a better idea of what's permissible, what not, like what might alienate the support base of the group. So I would say it was rather a technical and tactical adjustment that happened like within this so-called work of the axis of resistance. But it requires us to think very differently about the unity of arenas, which was one of the characteristics, presumed characteristics of this axis in the first place.
Has there been any attempt on the part of the Iraqi government or the official Hashd al-Shabi units and the PMF units and PMF institution to check these rogue elements and to check these rogue groups and to disassociate themselves from or counter any of these actions that put Iraq in some kind of danger in some ways?
There have been many attempts, and this is not a new phenomenon. This is also something that I would like to shed some light on, because these attempts had started already with Haider al-Abadi, with Adil Abdul Mahdi, later on Qadami al-Sudani. There have been different executive decrees meant to reglement in a way what this institution is allowed to do or not, the extent to which they are allowed to be engaging in economic or political activities. But I would say, I mean, I have to summarize here, like the trend was more, even if we look like at the structure of the PMF now, and if we compare it to what we had in 2018, the attempt was more to mimic, even in terms of structure, the language that's more typical of the Ministry of Defense structures than like to have this popular sort of parallel structure. The attempt was to make it more.
What I'm asking is, when these attacks were taking place, and they may resume again against Saudi, against Kuwait, against Israel, is there a panicked reaction? Is there an attempt on the part of the government or the PMF or others in Iraqi society and Iraqi institutions to stop them or to condemn them?
Of course, there is a very high alert. I mean, this is a logical reaction. The government realizes, and they have been trying to salvage the in a way integrity of Iraq, the relationship of Iraq also with the United States. We saw also the statements by Mohammed Shia al-Sudani towards the American partners. But also the difficulty was that a lot of the headquarters that were being hit as a form of retaliation in the course of the recent war were also formal headquarters of Hashd al-Sha'bi. Now, this we also have to understand, it's a very vicious circle in a way, because on the one hand, he's calling on all of the groups to respect the sovereignty of the state, monopoly on the use of force, all of this, trying to explore all of these different backdoor channels to exert pressures on the group and to preserve some form of stability in Iraq, to shield Iraq from any further geopolitical escalation. But then on the other hand, he's being condemned and mocked, and this is something that was very easily handed in the hands of those groups to make a mockery of the government by saying you're not being able to protect positions, military headquarters of Iraqi security forces. And I think in the way one even wants to engage militarily with the rogue groups, one really has to think twice and triple and to do more in coordination with the Iraqi government. Because the more talking points you hand into, let's say, the speaker of Kataib Hezbollah or of one of the other groups, the harder you make it for the commander-in-chief to really assert himself and to speak with confidence that, no, I am the one authority who can guarantee that I protect Iraq's security forces. And for that, I do not want any rogue group to interfere or to act outside of my mandate. But the problem comes from the fact that even if you have someone who has been assassinated as a part of a retaliation or a decapitation campaign because his group has been engaging in armed operations that were not, again, conducted on Hashd mandate. Yeah. If he turns out to be member of the Hashd, what you have after that is a state funeral. He's not being buried with the flag of Hezbollah. Yeah. He's being buried with the flag of the Hashd, of the PMF, next to the Iraqi flag, which really polarizes the debate. And we also have to keep in mind the sense of pride also in this community, that the moment it's really about sovereignty, the moment it's really about protecting the homeland, then you can always face the risk of evoking a rally around the flag effect. They're advised to be very careful in the way you study really the different membership structures, who is member of which Iraqi institution, and also the optics of retaliation operations.
Ina, thank you so much. This is Ina Rudolph. She is a researcher and scholar and author of a book, Iraq's Shia Militias from the Battlefield to Parliament. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Just a small correction, Iraq's Shia warriors from Battlefield to Parliament. And the goal of the book is really to answer the question, what is the brands that those actors have tried to build up within the structures of the Iraqi state? How do they perceive of themselves as state builders? And how this affects the trajectory of Iraqi statehood post-2003.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. I'm Borzou Deragahi. This is the Badlands Podcast. Please subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Hit the like button or follow button. And you can find me at borzou.substack.com.